At 64, Isiah Thomas is remembered as a two-time NBA champion and one of the greatest point guards ever. But the reason his story still hits people so hard isn't the trophies. It's the cost behind them, the parts of his life that never fit neatly into highlight reels. On the surface, his resume feels almost impossible. He was small by NBA standards, yet he became the brain and heartbeat of the Detroit Pistons. He controlled tempo, made the right reads under pressure, and played with a cold composure that separated him from most stars. The Bad Boys Pistons didn't just win. They forced the league to adjust. And Isiah was the engine, clever, ruthless when needed, and fearless in the moments that decide championships. But this story isn't only about basketball greatness. It's about what shaped him into a man who could thrive in chaos. Long before he ever stepped into an arena, he learned the psychology of survival. The transcript frames his early life as a place where fear was normal and stability was rare. Whether you take every detail literally or not, the emotional truth is clear. He grew up with the kind of stress that teaches a kid to hide pain, move fast, and never depend on someone else to rescue him. That mindset creates champions, but it also creates scars that fame can't erase. The world often treated Isiah like a contradiction. He was celebrated as a genius and criticized as a villain. Detroit fans loved him because he represented their city, tough, underestimated, and unapologetic. But outside Detroit, many people didn't want to romanticize the bad boy style, and Isiah became the symbol of what they disliked. When you lead a team the country loves to hate, you don't just carry a playbook. You carry a reputation, and reputation can follow you longer than championships. Then there are the moments that feel almost mythic, like the famous ankle game in the 1988 finals. Scoring 25 points in a single quarter while badly injured became a defining image of willpower. But the transcript insists on the part people ignore. Hero moments don't vanish after the crowd goes home. The body remembers. The pain becomes permanent. And sometimes the greatest performance of your career becomes the beginning of what you'll pay for the rest of your life. That's the tension at the heart of Isiah's tragedy. The world loves the legend, but the legend has to live with the consequences. And at 64, that contrast becomes sharper. The spotlight fades, but the injuries, the controversies, the isolation, and the old wounds don't fade the same way. In this story, Isiah Thomas isn't heartbreaking because he fell. He's heartbreaking because he kept getting back up again and again, until getting up became the hardest part. Isiah Thomas's story doesn't begin with an NBA arena. It begins in a place where survival was a daily assignment, and childhood wasn't measured in birthdays, but in the number of nights you made it through. The transcript paints Chicago's West Side in the 1960s and 1970s as a neighborhood shaped by violence, poverty, and constant instability, an environment where fear wasn't an interruption to life, it was part of the schedule. Whether every image is told with documentary precision or amplified for dramatic impact, the emotional core is unmistakable. Isiah grew up in conditions that trained his nervous system for danger long before it ever trained his body for basketball. One of the most defining wounds in this telling is abandonment. His father leaving is described not only as a family event, but as a psychological fracture, an unanswered question that became a quiet voice in the background of everything he did. Why wasn't I good enough for him to stay? That kind of question doesn't disappear when you become successful. In many cases, success only makes it louder because the child inside you still wants the one thing trophies can't guarantee: to be chosen, protected, and kept. Against that absence stands the figure of his mother, Mary Thomas, portrayed as the unbreakable shield in a house full of children and a neighborhood full of threats. The transcript describes her as fearless, someone willing to confront danger head-on to protect her family. In stories like this, a strong mother isn't just support. She becomes the entire concept of safety. And when safety is embodied in one person, you grow up learning two things at once: gratitude that runs deep and fear of what happens if that person can't hold the line. The transcript also emphasizes the weight of family struggle. Poverty here isn't presented as a simple lack of money. It's shown as a constant pressure that can split people apart. Addiction, arrests, instability, siblings pulled in different directions, and a sense that the world is actively trying to erase you. In that context, Isiah's development isn't about finding basketball. It's about finding one thing that could pull him forward when everything else was pulling people down. Then comes the loss that the transcript treats as the deepest early trauma: the murder of his brother, Larry Thomas, in 1980. This moment is positioned as a turning point, not only because of grief, but because it delivered a brutal lesson about reality. Success doesn't automatically protect the people you love. For a young man just beginning to rise, it meant that the past could still reach into the future and take something precious. It also meant that the distance between life and death wasn't abstract. It was personal, it was immediate, and it stayed. What's important here is how these experiences shape the personality the world later misinterpreted. The transcript frames young Isiah as small and often overlooked, a kid in a big family in a harsh neighborhood where attention is not a gift, it's a risk. That invisibility becomes a theme, being unseen at home, underestimated in school, doubted in sports. Coaches mock his size. People reduce him to measurements instead of hunger. And when you're repeatedly told you are too small, too weak, too insignificant, you eventually start living with a choice: shrink or force the world to look at you. Isiah, in this story, chooses the second path. But forcing the world to look at you comes with a cost. It means you learn not to ask for help. You learn to swallow pain. You learn to hide fear because fear invites attack. You become someone who performs toughness not because you want to look tough, but because you don't feel safe being anything else. That is the tragedy buried beneath the inspirational surface. His greatness wasn't built only on talent and practice. It was built on survival habits, hyper-awareness, stubborn pride, emotional restraint, and an intense sensitivity to rejection. Those habits can create an elite competitor. They can also create a lonely adult who struggles to feel accepted even when the world applauds him. So when later chapters describe Isiah being labeled a villain, excluded, misunderstood, and isolated, it doesn't feel like random bad luck. It feels like a continuation of an old pattern. Childhood didn't just shape his game. It shaped his internal battle, proving that he deserved to exist in spaces that kept trying to push him out. And that's why this story isn't merely about a basketball legend. It's about a survivor who never fully got to stop surviving. Indiana University was supposed to be the moment where Isiah Thomas's life finally felt safe. A clean campus, a structured program, a clear path out of chaos. In a normal sports story, college is where the hero finds confidence, support, and belonging. But in the story you're telling, Indiana wasn't a sanctuary. It was a furnace, one that could have destroyed him just as easily as it could have shaped him into a champion. Because the moment Isiah arrived in Bloomington, he didn't just meet a coach. He met a force. Bob Knight wasn't the kind of leader who developed players with gentle encouragement and long talks. He developed them by pressure, by confrontation, by humiliation when necessary, and by demanding a level of discipline that felt less like sports and more like military training. To the outside world, Knight was a genius. To many of the players, he was an authoritarian figure who could break your confidence in public and call it preparation. For Isiah, the timing was dangerous. He arrived with extraordinary talent, but he also arrived with a deep and quiet fear that he still wasn't good enough, that he still wasn't chosen, and that at any moment someone could decide he didn't belong. That fear wasn't created by basketball. It was created long before, by abandonment, poverty, and the constant message that a small kid from a hard place should not expect much from life. Indiana could have healed that fear. Instead, under Knight, it intensified it before it hardened into armor. The transcript describes Knight as someone who looked at Isiah like raw steel. Not a star to celebrate, but a material to test. Either the kid would harden into a champion or he would shatter. There was no middle ground. And from the very first practices, Knight made sure Isiah understood. Praise was rare as gold, and criticism came in hailstorms. This kind of environment reshapes a person quickly. When a coach screams at you in front of teammates, when mistakes are punished loudly, when you're made to run until you can't breathe, you start learning lessons beyond the sport. You learn that your value is conditional. You learn that being loved is not the point, being useful is. You learn that comfort is a weakness. And you learn that showing emotion will only give the world another handle to pull you apart. Isiah had already learned some of those lessons on Chicago's West Side. That's why Knight's pressure didn't break him immediately. But what Knight attacked wasn't Isiah's toughness. It was his need for acceptance. Isiah could handle pain. He could handle fatigue. He could handle being challenged. What haunted him was the possibility of being dismissed, of being abandoned again, this time by the person who controlled his future. The transcript includes a line that captures that cruelty perfectly. Knight telling him, in effect, "If you can't handle my pressure, you'll die in the NBA." It's a sentence that sounds like motivation when you quote it in a documentary, but when you hear it as a young man already carrying old wounds, it doesn't land like encouragement. It lands like a verdict. And this is where the tragedy theme deepens. Because the same pressure that can produce greatness can also plant a lifelong psychological scar. Isiah, in this story, spends nights alone in his dorm, swallowing tears, staring at blank walls, wondering if he should quit. He's not quitting because he's weak. He's quitting because the fear is exhausting. The fear of failing, the fear of proving the doubters right, the fear of being unwanted yet again. But then the transcript pivots to the survival instinct. When Isiah is at his lowest, he doesn't think about trophies. He thinks about where he came from, the West Side, the brother he lost, the mother who stood guard against violence. He thinks about the kids who never got a chance to leave their neighborhood. That context matters because it changes what Indiana means. College isn't a privilege to enjoy. It's a battle you cannot afford to lose. So Isiah stays. And over time, something complicated happens. He doesn't just get better. He becomes tempered. Every time Knight pushes him to the edge, Isiah learns how to hold himself steady under attack. Every time he's criticized, he learns how to convert that sting into focus. Indiana becomes a training ground not only for basketball execution, but for emotional control. And that's the real legacy of Bob Knight in this story. He teaches Isiah how to function under cruelty without collapsing. That is an elite skill in a league like the NBA. In professional basketball, pressure comes from everywhere: opponents, fans, contracts, media, the politics of superstar hierarchies. Many talented players fail not because they can't play, but because they cannot carry the psychological load. Indiana teaches Isiah that he can carry it. Then comes the championship. In 1981, Indiana wins the NCAA title, and Isiah is central to that run. It's not just a victory, it's validation. The suffering had a reason, the pressure produced something real. In the transcript, Knight hugs him, a moment that needs no speech, because for a player starved of approval, a rare gesture from a harsh coach can feel like the world finally acknowledging you. But here is the hidden price that makes this chapter tragic as well as triumphant. When you are forged through fear and conditional acceptance, you often leave with armor you can't take off. You become a person who is excellent at enduring, but not always excellent at relaxing. You become a person who can take pain in silence, but struggles to ask for help. You become a person who believes that worth must be earned every day, forever. That mindset helps Isiah dominate the NBA. It helps him lead the bad boys through hostility. It helps him play through injury. It helps him survive being hated. But it also sets up the later chapters, the loneliness, the misunderstandings, the internal pressure that never stops even when the crowd is cheering. So Indiana is not a simple college success chapter. It's the point where Isiah becomes both stronger and more burdened. It is the forge that creates a champion, and the place where he learns a devastating life lesson. If you want to be great, you may have to suffer in ways no one will ever fully see. And once that lesson is carved into you, you don't unlearn it. You carry it into every arena, every relationship, And every quiet morning when the ball is no longer bouncing, but the pressure still echoes in your head. When Isiah Thomas arrived in Detroit, he didn't step into a ready-made dynasty. He stepped into a franchise searching for identity, a city carrying economic and emotional scars, and a league where the hierarchy was already written in bold ink. The NBA had its glamour empires, the Lakers with Showtime, the Celtics with tradition, and it had its future myth in progress with players like Michael Jordan. Detroit was not invited to that inner circle. And Isiah, even as the number 2 pick with obvious brilliance, was not automatically welcomed either. In the transcripts telling, the first reality he faces is the same one he faced his whole life. People measure him and decide he doesn't fit. At 6 feet 1 inch, in an era that worshipped size and power, Isiah looked like an exception, not a blueprint. The doubt came quickly. Too small, too fragile, won't survive the physicality, won't last. But what isolated him wasn't only the physical mismatch, it was temperament. Isiah was not the kind of star who played politics easily. He didn't build his identity around being adored. He didn't naturally perform the social rituals that make powerful people comfortable. And in a league where relationships and alliances can influence narratives and opportunities, that made him vulnerable. This is where Detroit became more than a team. It became a solution. The transcript frames Isiah as someone who attracted the overlooked, the disrespected, the players who were never going to be marketed as the beautiful face of basketball. Together, they formed a family of outsiders, tough, defensive-minded, resentful of how the league framed them, and increasingly comfortable with the idea that if respect wasn't given, it would be taken. The bad boys' identity didn't appear out of nowhere. It was a reaction. It was a response to being treated as second-class competitors in a league that prized aesthetics as much as results. Detroit's basketball was not designed to be liked. It was designed to win. And that's the central moral tension of this chapter. Isiah is portrayed as a decent man who accepts the costume of the villain because it protects his team, his city, and his own right to exist at the top. If the league wanted heroes who smiled for cameras, Detroit would be the opposite. If the league wanted grace, Detroit would offer grit. If the league wanted dominance packaged as entertainment, Detroit would deliver dominance packaged as consequence. The cost of that choice was predictable. America doesn't mind a villain as long as the villain loses. When the villain starts winning, people get uncomfortable. The bad boys became a national target, not just criticized for physical play, but framed as a stain on the sport's image. To many, they weren't a rival. They were a problem to be solved. And Isiah, as leader, absorbed the symbolism. It didn't matter that other teams also played physically. It didn't matter that every era has its bruising tactics. Detroit's identity made it easy to point to them and say, "This is the darkness." In the transcript's language, Isiah becomes the face of ruthlessness, even if ruthlessness was never his private nature. He becomes the cold eyes behind the violence, the mastermind behind the hostility, the man who seemed to enjoy being hated. That reputation became its own prison, because once you're labeled, your actions are interpreted through that label forever. Confidence becomes arrogance. Competitiveness becomes cruelty. Standing firm becomes difficult. And Isiah's greatest irony emerges. The more he wins, the more the league needs him to remain the villain, because villains help make heroes shine brighter. Then comes the moment that defines him for people who didn't watch every Detroit season. The 1988 Finals, Game 6, the ankle injury, the 25-point quarter. In the mythology of basketball, it's one of the most heroic performances ever. A man playing through what looked like impossible pain, refusing to leave the stage. But the transcript refuses to let that moment remain a clean inspiration. It forces you to look at the hidden layer. Heroism has consequences, and the consequences don't belong to the fans who cheer. They belong to the body that has to wake up with the injury for decades. That is an essential point for a tragedy narrative. The crowd applauds the sacrifice, but only the athlete lives inside the sacrifice. In that quarter, Isiah does something that looks almost superhuman. The arena becomes silent, the opponent becomes irrelevant, and the only battle is between the will and the flesh. He scores as if pain is an illusion. And yet, Detroit loses. Not because his effort wasn't enough, but because sports are cruel and collective and unromantic in the final minutes. The transcript presents this as a kind of cosmic injustice, one of the greatest acts of courage in finals history, and it still ends in defeat. But tragedy is not only about losing. Tragedy is about paying even when you win. Detroit returns. In 1989 and 1990, the Pistons finally take the NBA's crown twice. The results should settle everything. They should prove the legitimacy. They should grant Isiah the kind of universal respect that champions receive. Yet the transcript argues the opposite. The championships only sharpened the isolation. Detroit reached the peak, but the peak was cold. The team was still resented. The style was still condemned. The narrative still resisted, making them heroic. So Isiah becomes a champion without full acceptance. And if you understand his background, you understand why that matters so much. He spent his whole life trying to be seen as worthy, first by family, then by coaches, then by the league itself. Winning was supposed to silence the doubt. Yet even after he climbed the mountain, the doubt remained in the way people spoke about him and his team. This is also where the transcript begins to set up the dream team wound. Because the dream team is not merely about basketball talent. It's about acceptance. It's the league's official statement of who belongs in the pantheon, who represents the sport, who represents the country. And Isiah, despite his resume, still carried the bad boy stigma, still carried interpersonal tensions, still carried the reputation of being divisive. So the Detroit chapter becomes the foundation of his greatest contradiction. He was too brilliant to ignore, but too inconvenient to embrace. And that contradiction is tragic because it forces a person into permanent performance. If you're loved, you can soften. If you're tolerated, you must stay sharp. Isiah, in this narrative, never gets to relax into love. He has to keep proving. He has to keep fighting. He has to keep wearing the villain's armor to protect the decent man inside. In the end, Detroit gives Isiah everything and takes everything. It gives him family, identity, and championships. It also gives him scars. Physical scars from the most violent era of his career and reputational scars that follow him far beyond the court. And it teaches him a brutal lesson. Sometimes you can win the title and still lose the crowd. That's why this chapter is so powerful, because it refuses to treat victory as a happy ending. For Isiah Thomas, victory was just another battlefield, one where the prize was not only the trophy, but the right to exist in a league that never fully decided it wanted him there. If Detroit was the chapter where Isiah Thomas proved he could win against the entire league, 1992 was the chapter where the league proved something far more painful. Winning does not guarantee acceptance. The Dream Team wasn't just an Olympic roster. It was the NBA's global coronation, an eternal photograph that would hang in history as the greatest team ever assembled. For the players selected, it became more than a medal opportunity. It became immortality. And for Isiah, being left off that roster wasn't a basketball decision in his mind, not the way the public likes to frame it. In the transcript's telling, it was a social verdict. You may be great, but you are not wanted. That is a specific kind of cruelty, because talent can be measured, rings can be counted, film can be reviewed, but not wanted has no clean scoreboard. It's vague enough to deny, but sharp enough to bleed you for the rest of your life. And for a man whose deepest childhood wound was abandonment, the feeling that he was never chosen, this wasn't just a snub. It was the oldest pain returning at the highest altitude. What made it worse, according to the narrative, was the silence around it. No direct explanation. No official clarity. Just the sense that the decision was shaped by the same invisible forces that shape so many legacies. Relationships, reputations, grudges, and the politics of who gets to represent the sport's best face. Isiah could handle being hated on the court. Detroit taught him that. But this wasn't hatred in competition. This was exclusion in a moment of unity. It told him that even when the world needed a team, some people still preferred he not be part of it. And the transcript frames it as betrayal not only by the league, but by people he once considered close. That detail matters because it turns a professional disappointment into a personal fracture. When rejection comes from strangers, you can dismiss it as noise. When it comes from people you thought were family, it becomes a wound with a voice. It replays in your mind with new questions. Was I ever truly respected? Was the love real? Was the brotherhood conditional the whole time? For Isiah, the dream team becomes a permanent scar because it symbolizes something he could never fix. There's no rematch, no second chance, no late correction. History moved forward without him, and every time the dream team is celebrated, the absence repeats itself, loudly, without him having to say a word. Then comes the second collapse, the body. The transcript moves from public rejection to physical betrayal, and the timing is brutal. For years, Isiah had accumulated damage the way a soldier collects shrapnel. Ankles, knees back, everything strained by a style of basketball that demanded contact and sacrifice. He had already paid dearly for being heroic. But in 1994, the story tells it as if fate finally shut the door, a ruptured Achilles that ended his playing career not with ceremony, but with silence. There is something uniquely cruel about an athlete's ending that arrives without closure. One day you are the center of a living machine. Game plans, teammates, locker room roles, adrenaline, the rhythm of travel and competition. The next day, you are alone with your own thoughts and a calendar that no longer belongs to the sport. If you've spent your entire life using basketball as survival, the removal of basketball feels like the removal of oxygen. And that's where the transcript's psychological focus becomes sharper. Isiah didn't just retire from the NBA. He lost the identity that had protected him from his own darkness. Depression doesn't arrive like a dramatic cinematic breakdown. Often it arrives like emptiness. Folk, a slow erosion of meaning. He wakes up and the sound that once anchored him, the bounce of the ball, the roar of the arena, is gone. People stop needing him in the same way. The world stops calling. And in that quiet, he faces the most frightening question of his adult life. If I'm not the player, then who am I? That identity crisis is the hidden cliff that many athletes fall from. The public assumes the hardest part is injuries or criticism or losing. But the hardest part is often the moment when your purpose disappears and no one taught you how to build a new one. So he tries to pivot. He tries to build a second career. And the transcript treats this phase as a sequence of bruises that come not from opponents, but from reputation and chaos. He becomes involved in basketball operations, leadership roles, business ventures, attempts to prove that he wasn't only a great player, but a builder. Yet the story emphasizes how quickly those efforts became magnets for criticism. Mistakes weren't treated as learning curves. They were treated as evidence that the villain was finally being exposed. The same public that once praised his toughness seemed eager, in this telling, to enjoy his failures. Then the narrative arrives at the most explosive chapter, the New York Knicks era. New York is not a forgiving ecosystem. It is a spotlight that burns. Every decision becomes a headline, and every headline becomes a story about character. If Detroit was harsh on the body, New York was harsh on the identity. According to the transcript, Isiah enters a tangled organization full of internal conflict, public pressure, and constant second-guessing. The press doesn't just evaluate results, it hunts for weakness. And Isiah, already carrying the dream team wound and the post-retirement emptiness, becomes a target. In this kind of environment, the person's life is no longer their own. They are turned into a symbol of failure, of controversy, of decline. Even if there are layers, ownership interference, organizational dysfunction, variables beyond one person's control, the public prefers simple villains. And Isiah, already known as the bad boys leader, fits the shape too easily. Then comes the lawsuit chapter, the moment where criticism turns into something darker. The transcript references sexual harassment allegations brought by a former employee and the national humiliation that followed. This is where the story becomes especially tragic in tone because it depicts a man who insists on his denial but is still publicly marked. Regardless of where viewers land on the complexity, the psychological outcome described is clear. The feeling that the world has decided who you are and nothing you say can change it. And that is the most devastating form of powerlessness for someone who built his entire life on willpower. Isiah could outwork people, outthink them, outlast them, but you cannot compete against public perception once it hardens into a label. You cannot drop 25 points in a quarter against a narrative. You cannot ice your ankle and heal a reputation. You just wake up one day and realize your name means something you cannot control. The transcript frames the aftermath as withdrawal, silence, avoidance, fear of being seen not as the champion, but as the headline. And the theme repeats again, abandonment. The sense that no one stands beside him publicly the way he once stood beside teammates in war. The sense that the world was always ready to applaud the myth, but discard the man. By the time Isiah Thomas reaches his 60s, the story stops being about competition and becomes about consequence. The NBA world remembers him as a champion, as the mind of the bad boys, as the man who could bend a game with timing and nerve. But the transcript insists that in old age, none of that matters to the body. The body does not negotiate with legacy. It only collects what it is owed. For Isiah, the debt is paid in small, daily moments that never make headlines. Chronic back pain that turns mornings into negotiations. Knees that creak with every step down a staircase. And above all, the right ankle. The ankle that once made him immortal in 1988 and then quietly sentenced him to decades of lingering pain. The ankle game is celebrated as a heroic image, but the transcript frames it as a trade. The world got an unforgettable moment, and Isiah got a lifetime reminder carved into his joints. That is one of the most brutal truths about elite sports. The most applauded moments often come from the most costly decisions. Fans see willpower. Athletes feel inflammation, stiffness, and instability that grows worse with age. The injuries that were managed in your 20s and 30s become unavoidable in your 50s and 60s. And what once felt like toughness starts to feel like punishment. The transcript describes Isiah sometimes needing to pause mid-walk, brace against a wall, breathe through the stab of pain, and accept help from the people around him. For a man whose identity was built on never showing weakness, that is a uniquely humiliating shift. It's not only that he hurts, it's that he has to be seen hurting. It forces him to confront the gap between who he was and what his body can now do. And pain does not stay inside the body. It leaks into everything else. When the body is constantly uncomfortable, the mind rarely rests. Sleep becomes fragile. The transcript describes nights where memories return, not as calm reflections, but as intrusive replays. Gunshots from childhood, the loss of his brother, the ache of being excluded, the humiliation of later public chapters. Whether every scene is literal or not, the psychological logic is consistent. Chronic pain keeps the nervous system in a heightened state. In that state, the brain can drift toward threat and memory, toward old battles, because it still feels as if it is fighting. This is where the tragedy becomes deeper than physical decline. It becomes existential. Isiah's life, as told here, was driven by motion. When he was young, motion was survival. Move fast, stay alert, avoid danger. In basketball, motion was identity, push tempo, attack gaps, control the game. After basketball, motion became escape, build something new, prove value again, outrun the silence. But aging reduces motion. It imposes stillness. And stillness is where people finally face what they've carried. For Isiah, the transcript suggests that stillness brings an uncomfortable truth. The victories that once protected him from darkness no longer protect him the same way. 2 championships can't quiet a painful night. A finals MVP can't erase the feeling of being unwanted. An iconic performance can't restore a joint. The tools that once made him feel powerful become less useful when the battlefield changes. And yet, the story does not frame old Isiah as bitter. It frames him as quieter, softer, but somehow deeper. There's a difference between anger and clarity. Anger demands an outcome. Clarity accepts reality. The transcript suggests he has moved toward clarity, not because the pain stopped, but because he has lived long enough to understand that life does not always reward fairness. What stands out most in this chapter is the shift from proving to giving. The transcript portrays him spending time with young people, especially those from environments like the one he came from. The logic is almost poetic. If he can't outrun pain anymore, he can still turn pain into purpose. If he can't dominate on a court, he can still help kids avoid the traps that swallowed so many around him. In that sense, Detroit becomes more than a basketball memory. It becomes a responsibility, a place that once gave him identity and now receives his effort in return. And that is the final twist of aging in this story. Old age takes away speed, strength, and spotlight, but it can also strip away the need to impress. It can leave you with what is essential. So the tragedy of Isiah Thomas at 64 is not only that he hurts, it's that he is forced to live with everything at once. The physical debt of his bravest moments, the emotional debt of being misunderstood, and the quiet daily work of continuing anyway. Not loudly, not heroically on camera, just continuing step by careful step, like a survivor who never truly stopped surviving. When people look back on Isiah Thomas, they often reach first for the clean summary. 2 championships, Detroit's fearless leader, one of the greatest point guards ever. It's a neat story, the kind sports history likes to package. But the transcript you provided refuses neatness. It argues that the real measure of Isiah's life isn't the rings, the trophies, or even the famous moments. It's what happened after the crowd stopped watching, when the victories faded into memory and the consequences stayed. Because the tragedy in this story is not that Isiah failed. It's that he succeeded and still carried the same wounds. He rose from a childhood shaped by danger and instability, only to learn that success doesn't erase the past. It only changes the scenery. He became a champion, yet never fully escaped being labeled, doubted, or treated as inconvenient. He produced a legendary finals performance, yet his body paid for it for decades. He reached the highest levels of the sport, yet still faced one of the most painful forms of rejection, being left out of the moment that immortalized his era. And the older he got, the clearer that truth became. Fame quiets down. The phone rings less. The world moves on to new names. But pain doesn't move on. The body remembers what it sacrificed. The mind remembers what it never received. Clarity, closure, acceptance. That is why the transcript's final message is simple and devastating. The greatest victory wasn't winning. It was surviving. Surviving a childhood where safety wasn't guaranteed. Surviving grief that never fully healed. Surviving a league that admired him but didn't always embrace him. Surviving the loneliness of being cast as a villain. Surviving the brutal transition when basketball ended and identity felt like it ended with it. Surviving public storms that tried to reduce him to a headline instead of a human being. Yet the most striking thing in this telling is what Isiah does not become. He does not become purely bitter. He does not spend his life trying to burn down the people who hurt him. He does not make his pain into a weapon. Instead, the transcript portrays him as a man who grows quieter with age, but also more purposeful. Someone who understands that the most meaningful legacy isn't always written in record books. Sometimes it's written in the lives you touch when no cameras are present. In that sense, the story closes with a kind of hard-earned dignity. Not a fairy tale ending, not a triumphant victory lap, but something closer to truth. A man who accepts that life is not always just, but refuses to let injustice define him. The world may debate his place in the mythology. People may argue about why doors closed on him, but the transcript suggests that Isiah's final answer to all of it is the only one that matters to a survivor.